If there is any chance you don't know the classic Bible tale of Zacchaeus, his tree, and his encounter with Jesus, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to relinquish your credentials and please exit out the rear. I'm joking, but I can joke about it because it's ridiculous to imagine anyone having gone through, from children to adults, having gone through any experience in church and not come away with an understanding of this story of this tax collector and the man who was not afraid to dine with him. Now, I've been in church since before I could remember. And it's extremely unlikely that someone in my situation would have missed this story. In fact, I can still see the brightly colored felt board characters that my Sunday school teacher used to illustrate different Bible stories. You know, it was either red or green felt, and the characters stuck right on there. And for this particular story, there'd be a few different miscellaneous characters, and the teacher would try to slip Jesus in the middle of a lot of them, and some would come falling off. You remember the felt board Sunday school characters. I certainly did. I have fond memories of them, no matter how poorly they were drawn or constructed. I love them. However, that was before, that my understanding of Zacchaeus through feltboard characters was before I got involved in our church's drama troupe. Even before our days in high school drama, where I met my beautiful wife, our youth leader would write dramas for us to perform. One of them was called Nasty Zach, of course based on Luke 19. I played one of the two characters who were tasked playing the tree. Seriously though, a guy named Todd and I played the tree, Tree 1 and Tree 2, up which Nasty Zach physically climbed. Our youth leader, Hank, who was a pretty great actor in his own right, would write these plays, and he wrote himself in as the character of Zach. And honestly, looking back on things, I don't think anybody else could have played the character. He came from the back of the sanctuary yelling insults at the audience. I hate Christians, I hate church, and I hate you. He was Nasty Zach. He was playing it up so people would get the gist that Zacchaeus was not a nice guy. And so when he made his way up to the stage, it was me and Todd, my tree partner, and the narrator of the story. And we were all three standing on where the pastor sat, looking to where Jesus was, to emphasize the fact that Zacchaeus was indeed short. And so he was jumping around, trying to see, and getting more and more perturbed by the experience. And then the trees forgot the entry line as part of the skit. So he would repeat the line a couple of times, and all of a sudden we look to each other and say, "The tree!" And so we jump down, and I'm standing here, he's standing here, and I've got my arm around him, and he's got his leg in front of me, and right where our legs met is where Zach would climb up and steady himself on our heads and our faces. It was all very slapstick, and the audience was uproarious. Eventually, Jesus notices Zach while he's climbing all over us, and Zach goes off to have a meal with Jesus. And after he returns a much nicer man, returning tax monies to the villagers at a fantastic rate of interest. And the end of the skit is the rest of the tree, the narrator, and Zach all just run around passing around Tootsie Rolls, because evidently the currency of the village he was going through was Tootsie Rolls. Now, with varying degrees of detail, that's the story we all know and love, right? Jesus seeks out the most hated person in the crowd, gets to know them in a very personal way, and while we can't be sure of this by the story in the text, we learn the reconciliation of Mr. Zach as a result. So we know this story. Who do we identify with in this story? Because that's sort of the idea. We read Scripture and try to connect with the characters. Who do we connect with? Jesus? I hope it's not Jesus. It shouldn't be Jesus. There's a problem if you identify yourself with Jesus in this story, in that there's only one Jesus and there's a good chance that you're not him. But I digress. Seriously though, who do we identify with? Do we identify with Zach? Nasty Zach? Or do we identify with the crowds? Because the tree really isn't an option in this. It's likely that we identify with Zach, right? I mean, who wouldn't? We as Christians, as we grow up in the church, are taught to always consider ourselves sinners redeemed by the grace of God. I mean, right? In a way, that's as it should be. I don't mean that it's a bad thing to look at ourselves as sinners who are saved by the amazing grace of God. What I mean is that this posture forces us to see certain aspects of ourselves in different scenarios. For example, we're more likely, in my opinion, to identify with the prodigal son than with the prodigal son's brother. And if we're not a fan of either team in the Super Bowl, I think we're much more likely to root for whoever is the underdog. And even though the scripts are written in such a way as to make us feel a certain way about the characters, we're more likely to feel common cause with Hickory than South Bend in the movie Hoosiers. Am I right? Well, I mean, being Hoosiers ourselves, we would identify, of course, with the small school, the small farm community school. And we're more likely to see certain aspects of ourselves as underdogs, and that's why I believe, in my opinion, that most people identify with Zacchaeus. What's the point? Our rightful characterization as sinners saved by the unending love and amazing grace of God, in my opinion, pulls our heartstrings in the direction of other underdogs. So we identify with Zacchaeus. Now, as I'm writing this message this week, I tried to identify with other people in this story. I couldn't put myself in the place of someone who might identify with the crowd. Now, to be sure, I can totally imagine, or really admit it, if I'm being honest, having done as the crowds did. However, the crowd is some type of amorphous entity that we easily overlook. You know, we're worried about what's going on over here with Jesus, that we're ignoring what's going on behind us or around us. But in this story, it's easy for us to sort of put them out of the question. Now today, for the person who has been in church for a while, who has not been in church for a while, or who, let's face it, is more and more common, who has never been in church, the crowd is more than a portion of the story that we can block out. For those people, the people Jesus calls us to reach out to, they see the crowd and are much less likely to see Jesus for the crowd. That means the crowd is the face of the church. And just in case you missed the transition here, the crowd is indeed now us. The question for us, then, is what does Zacchaeus see when Zacchaeus climbs the tree today? Does Zacchaeus see a throng of followers hanging on Jesus' every word and deed, allowing that example to inform our lives? Does Zacchaeus see a group of people just eager to catch a glimpse of Jesus, knowing that that glimpse of Jesus could completely transform their life? Or does Zacchaeus see what the crowds surrounding Jesus have actually become and just decide to climb back down? Imagine you're the one who's climbed the tree today and are surveying the scene below. Certainly you would see people in the crowd who are genuinely there for the experience of an interaction with Jesus. Most certainly that would be there. They are there for him to allow him to inform and transform their lives. However, it isn't too long before something else captures your attention. Maybe over there is a group kicking up some dust, complaining to Jesus because the Romans wouldn't let them hang their religious artifacts in Pilate's palace. Then a ruckus steers your attention over to two groups here, one on either side of Jesus, arguing over who follows Jesus the best, or more rightly than the other. There's name-calling and self-righteous indignation being shouted right over Jesus' head. Oh yeah, he's there, but it doesn't really matter because they're too busy knocking each other in the face. There's name-calling, the self-righteous indignation. Jesus is there, but he might as well not be there. Then there's one man whose voice rises over the rest of the noises of the crowd. He's started to say some pretty fantastical, even maybe some offensive things. The odd thing is, some of the things he says begins to ring true with some people. Oh, it's the gospel that they want to hear. And pretty soon they begin to follow him and not Jesus. On an unrelated note, megachurch pastor Mark Driscoll has a book coming out this Tuesday that you might want to look at. Maybe a little too inside for Sunday morning. But what does Zacchaeus think about the church today? Has he seen anything that might encourage him to seek Jesus out? Is Jesus able to rise above the level of chaos the crowds have managed to kick up around him so Zacchaeus could respond to Jesus' invitation? Or does Zacchaeus look at the turmoil and chaos, remember he has a family at home, and that Sunday is his only morning to sleep in and get any sort of rest, and just decide to climb back down? If we're honest with ourselves, that's what's been happening for the last 50 years in the church, that is. Zacchaeus hasn't had much of a reason to wait on Jesus to look up in the tree. Luckily for Zacchaeus then, and all the Zacchaeuses today, luckily for Zacchaeus, Jesus is able to override the crowds. Call Zacchaeus down from that tree and into a new life. See, this juxtaposes the story of Zacchaeus, sets up very nicely against the story of another rich person Jesus has interaction with. The rich young ruler from just a chapter prior. That ruler was called by Jesus, but the ruler couldn't fathom doing as Jesus suggested and giving up all that he owned. It certainly proved that what Jesus said in chapter 11 about a camel going through the eye of the needle, well, it may be very difficult. Zacchaeus proves it's not impossible and most certainly can be done. The ruler couldn't imagine turning himself into a smaller camel in order to thread the needle Jesus called him to thread. Considering all that, however, there is so much good news we can glean from the story of Zacchaeus' encounter with Jesus. First, while Jesus uses an obviously outrageous analogy for the rich young ruler, he doesn't call it impossible. Zacchaeus proves that there is hope for the least and the greatest of all of us sinners and wretches. That's good news. The gospel. The good news of the gospel is that no matter how bad you think you are, God's power is greater. No matter how unworthy you believe yourself to be, God's grace is beyond your ability to come up with reasons for God not to love you. That's very good news. Second, that also means that there's hope for the people Jesus left behind to continue his work. Yeah, the church stinks right now. Our organizations and structures are broken and ridiculously ineffective. We yell at each other and obscure the good news of the gospel for the whole world. But that doesn't mean here in Forest, our neighboring cluster churches all over the world can't still be the people God has called us to be. The people of the way. What Christians were originally called way back in the book of Acts. People of the way Jesus taught us to live. We can still be a community that acts as God's hands and feet to reach a world that desperately needs good news. And it does need good news. Which leads me to the third thing. In this story, we see yet another example, more proof to us. Understanding more fully, because human beings can never really understand too well the love of God. We understand even more how wonderful and powerful the love of God is. Today, to the church around the world, the church in Forest, and to each of his creations in the entirety of the universe, God's Son is reaching out his hand and bidding us come and commune with him. As we seek to commune with him in this time, approaching the Lord's table in a very real way, let us seek to commune with him in all of the times in our lives. And as always, giving thanks to God for the privilege. Amen.